This is Jenny Kunkel, and in this video we are going to go through how to add SQL code to a Java application. And we first need to start out with downloading our IDE. If you do not currently have IntelliJ IDEA, the Community Edition, that's the free edition, you want to navigate to the jetbrains.com/idea/download site. Once you're there, you want to go to the middle of the page, and this would be where you're going to download IntelliJ IDEA. Additionally, if you want to take a look at the user interface, we will be using JavaFX, and when we use JavaFX, we have the ability to open up our user interface and do design within Scene Builder. You can download Scene Builder and install it using this page. It's not necessary if you don't want to actually look at the actual user interface and see how everything is connected. You do not need to download this, but if you want to go through the effort of trying to figure out how everything is connected, then you would want to go through and download the JavaFX Scene Builder, and it steps you through how you can do that with the help information on the IntelliJ JetBrains site. The other thing that we're going to definitely need is we need to download our Microsoft JDBC driver for SQL. And we can navigate to the page. You can just do a search for it, and it's going to bring you to a page that you can scroll down halfway, almost to the end of the page without scrolling. And we need to download the zip file and extract that. That's going to be one of the things that we need to do. I'm going into my downloads. Once I extract this, I'm going to need to copy a couple files from my extracted zip file over to my IntelliJ project. So I'm going to go ahead and locate where I've downloaded the project that we're going to be working on from our class. And in my case, I put it in my Spring JavaFX folder, and you can see where the zip was downloaded. And I am going to essentially place the files that I need in this location. So if I go into my auth folder, we're going to need to use one of those files, because if we would happen to not include the auth file, we're going to get security type issues that are going to come into play. So we want to copy that, and we're just going to paste it in this directory over here. We're going to come back and we're going to go up. This time we want to go into our jars, and we want to grab the msql-jdbc-12.8.1 JRE11.jar. We're going to copy that over, and those are going to give us the two files that we need to set up in order to do the connection to SQL Server. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy this location, and then I'm going to open up IntelliJ IDEA. Once I do that, if I'm already in a file location, I can close it. And I'm just going to go ahead and open, and then I can paste in my file location, and it should just open up my solution. We should see those two files that we just added, and then there's going to be a bunch of source files that exist in our directory here underneath our rvc.cis-254.pilot maintenance folder, and we'll be looking at those. If we try to compile them right now, they're not going to compile because we have a bunch of database imports that we're going to need to add once we get our driver installed. Now, the very first thing we want to do is we want to come up to our pilot maintenance. So we're going to stand on the project, right click, and then we want to go into our open module settings. Now, the first thing that we want to do is we want to come up to the project. If you've never used IntelliJ, you're potentially not going to have some type of an SDK or JDK, and you're going to want to go ahead and do this. So if you don't have something specified, in my case, I have a whole list of them, so it's already got something that it's defaulting to, which is the Oracle JDK 23. If you don't see anything in the list and it's showing you no SDK, you can go ahead and hit the download JDK, and it's going to download from Oracle an Open JDK version for you. It's going to immediately install it and then associate it. So I'm going to go ahead and click off of that. So that's the first thing that we want to check to make sure that we have an association to a JDK, otherwise it's not going to work. Then we want to go into our modules. Now in the modules, what we want to do is we want to click over to our dependencies tab, and we can see that we have a lot of Maven dependencies at this point. We want to go ahead and add jars or directories. And in this case, we want to drill into our folder until we see our jar file and our DLL. And we want to go ahead and highlight both of those and say OK. Once we do that, we can go ahead and say apply and OK. And then hopefully we have everything set up to do our database connection. So we're going to start with our connection factory. And we can see that we have some imports that are needed. I'm just going to go ahead and do an Alt-Enter and import from java.sql. Go ahead and import the class here as well. Alt-Enter, import class. Go ahead and import the class as well. And we see that we have one related problem. If we click into it, it's going to take us into our DB connection class. And I'm going to go ahead and Alt-Enter, java.sql, go down to the next one, do the same thing, Alt-Enter, import class, Alt-Enter, import class as well. Once we are finished with that, we still have related problems here that we're going to potentially need to take care of. One of the things here is we have this date. If we do an Alt-Enter, we want to import class, but the class that we want to import is going to be the SQL date, which it did, so we're good there. It's going to have other issues until we can get to the point that we can set the birth date. We are going to go to our connection. We still have one here because of this. If we go to our pilot, everything here looks okay except for this one import. We need to go ahead and do that. Scrolling down here, we don't see any more issues. Then we can go ahead and take a look at our pilot. That looks good. Our controller here, as we scroll through, we have one issue here, and the date is going to essentially need to be importing the java.sql date. We may have to actually go ahead and code the import because we have the util that's being imported as well. It may just go ahead and obfuscate that for us. So underneath our import of our java.util, we're going to go ahead and do an import of java.sql.date. And I think that that should resolve the issue that we were seeing there. If we look at our DAO, make sure that we don't have any issues there. Our pilot list, if we scroll down, not seeing any issues there. So at this point, everything should be good. Let's go back to our connection factory. This is going to be where we need to put our connection. We need to indicate what our server name is. We need to indicate the database that we're trying to work against. We need to provide our username, password, etc. And we're going to update this. Within our double quotes, we want to go ahead and put in JDBC :SQL server. This is going to be : //localhost : 15433 semicolon. Then we're going to follow this with database name, and this is going to be equal to Northwinds, followed by a semicolon. Then we're going to do an encrypt equal false, followed by a semicolon. User is going to be equal to SA, semicolon. Password is going to be equal to testing at 112233. And that's going to essentially be our connection string. Everything else in the class is pretty much set up. We are creating an instance of our driver class. So this is going to be the driver that we're using. when we come down here, we're going to essentially provide the class for name using this com.microsoft.sql server.jdbc.sql server driver. Once we establish that, then we can go ahead and get the connection. And then we're going to use our driver manager to get the connection using our connection URL. And then we can go ahead and connect to the database. Let's go ahead and let's make sure that we have our current file specified, and we want to go ahead and run the current file. We have a main. This is going to tell us whether we're connected to the database or not. If for some reason we have a problem, maybe it's because we don't have everything quite right as far as the inputs that we selected throughout the project, or maybe we didn't get our driver installed just right. Might want to go back and review that. So now we have our driver all set up. We can see that we are connected and we're ready to move on. The next thing that we need to take a look at is our database connection. And this is going to be essentially what we call to connect to the database. And we have a couple different ways that we can do that. We can connect to the database. We can connect with a transaction. And a transaction is going to allow us to roll back anything that we need to do. So in some cases, when we're looking to do some testing of our insert, update, and delete commands, we're going to go ahead and use a transaction and roll it back so that we don't impact any of the data that's in the database. We have our close coded here, and we have a commit and rollback as well. One of the things that we are going to do is we are going to code out our pilot DAO class. We have some methods that are stubbed out. Essentially, they're not doing anything at this point. They're returning 0, they're returning an empty list, etc. But we do have a test method. And if we run this test method right now, it's going to function, but it's not really going to do anything at this point because we're not hitting the database. We're not trying to update, insert, delete, or do anything against the database. We're going to make sure that everything we do works before we try to implement it into our interface. Now, if we go ahead and look, we are going to also have a pilot list, and this is going to be what we call from our controller. And we're going to have different methods here that are essentially, when I instantiate the list, it's going to go out and get a list of the pilots to show. And then I can remove a pilot, I can update a pilot, I can add a pilot, and these are the methods that I'm going to call that basically are going to connect to my pilot DAO, which we'll be coding shortly, and that's how it's going to get access to do the updates to the database. Now we have our controller, and this is going to interface with our user interface. So when we click a button, we're going to essentially go through our controller, and then it's going to essentially reach out to different things to actually do. If we look at this refresh pilot table, I think it's probably down at the bottom for some of the multi-use things. We can see that we're instantiating that pilot list. And then once we have that pilot list, that's going to have the list of all of the information. And then we're going to use that get pilot list information to set the observable array object that we see. So this is going to give us a data table of information. We have different buttons that we're going to do, and we'll take a look at those in a little bit more detail after we get the guts coded. We also have our user interface that we'll be looking at, and that is going to be underneath our resources, and it's all coded in this FXML. If I go ahead and do a right click on my FXML, I can open it up in Screen Builder, and this is going to give me a user interface where I can pretty much drag and drop and organize different things. Like if I decide that I want to add a button, I can search for a button, I can drag it onto the canvas. If I click on my button, I can see all the properties. We have the properties on the first tab that I can change out things. I think I changed out the fonts to make them a little more bold. We can see the different font face that I'm using. We also have a code reference that allows us to access things that we define in the controller. In this case, we have the load data button that's defined in our controller. and we have our onLoad data button clicked. That's a method that we defined in our controller that we can call so we can connect these things together in our user interface. We just need to mark them in our controller, and we'll see how that works in just a little bit. Before we do anything, we want to go ahead and start working on some of our access methods to get information from our database. So I'm going to get out of Screen Builder here, and we're going to go to our Pilot DAO class. And this is going to be where I need to do stuff. And the first thing that we might want to do is we might want to go ahead and get the pilots. Now, thinking about this, this is going to be kind of generic. I'm potentially going to want to create some type of a method that I can provide some information, and based on whether I have a pilot or not, then I can go ahead and execute a generic method to do two things, because I want to not only do the get pilots, I also want to do the get pilot with pilot number. So I'm going to use a helper method, and I'm going to come down and define it down below. Oh, I guess I already did. So we already have that coded. So we can take a look at that. How lucky are we? So we have our get pilot information, and it's going to take in a SQL statement, and it's going to take in a pilot number. Now we're using the big I integer class because that's going to allow us to have a null value that's passed in instead of an integer value. And we can then interrogate it and determine whether we have a null value, which means that we should do a selection of all the records, versus if I have a pilot number that I want to actually execute and select just one. So we have an array that we're creating, and we're going to use a prepare statement. And our prepare statement, we are executing a SQL statement, and that is going to be passed in. So it's going to either be something that we do where we're selecting all the pilots, or if we're selecting a single pilot. So that's going to be something that we need to pass in. Once we have that passed in, then we can execute that query, and it's going to return to us a result set. And then we can iterate over our result set. Think of it like a file where we can iterate over it until we hit the end of file. This is going to be the end of our results. And we're going to go through and create an instance of a pilot and populate the data based off of what is in that result set, and then add it to our pilot list. And we can see that we're referencing it based on the different types. We're getting an integer for our pilot, no. We're getting a string for our first name, last name. We're getting a date for the birthday, strings for the rest of the fields, and then adding it to the pilot. Then we're closing our database connection, and then we're returning our list. Now, if I decide to come up here, I need to provide my SQL statement. And this is just going to be flat out SQL statement that I want to provide. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and do a SQL statement. I already have this defined, and I'm going to use the 3 quotes that's going to allow me to do a multi-line statement here. And I'm going to go ahead and code out my select, and this is just going to be select pilot no, comma, first name, comma, last name, comma, birth date, comma, SSN, comma, cell phone no, comma, gender. And this is going to be from do.pilot. And we're going to order by the pilot no. Once I have my statement completed, then I'm going to go ahead and, instead of doing a new array list, I actually want to call that get pilot information method, passing in my SQL statement. And in this case, I don't have a pilot to pass in, so I'm going to be passing in null. It's going to see that, and it's going to then go ahead and execute everything there. Now, I can go ahead, and if I come down to the bottom, I can see that I can run my pilots, and it should iterate out and dump a list for me on the screen. So if I save everything and I run it, I should see that I have some of my pilots, and it says I'm attempting to delete pilot 9. Of course, it's not doing anything in my delete, so then it's just going to go ahead and do everything here, and it's got some issues here, but that's okay. We'll take care of those as we go through. So now we've gotten back our list of pilots from the database using our select statement and that all-purpose helper method that we used here that was already coded for us, which was nice. We didn't have to go through that, just talked about it a little bit. Now we need to go ahead and do our delete because that was the next thing that was showing us there. So for our delete, what we want to do is we need to go ahead and do our select statement, and I'm just going to essentially copy and paste some of this in to save a little bit of time. I don't want to go too long on this video. So I'm going to paste in to this method my select statement. And you'll notice here that my select statement has a pilot no equal to a question mark. And that question mark is actually a bind parameter. When we're doing applications, we should always use bind parameters for two reasons. We can't always understand what users are going to enter into text fields, and they could be doing something that they really shouldn't be doing. And that's where we kind of get into some of our SQL injection. We want to make sure that that's not the case. And one of the ways that we can kind of cut down on that as a risk is to use bind parameters. The second reason to use bind parameters is that with our select statements and our query statements, could be delete, insert, update, if we have something and we're providing a bind variable, it's going to make it such that it is a generic query. And if we have something that we're trying to execute, it's going to go look for the query execution plan. And if we have a query that's very generic that has been used before, it will use that instead of trying to create a new query execution plan. And therefore, it is much more performant than if we have to wait for the database to try to figure out how it needs to execute things. So we like this from a performance perspective, and we should always try to use bind parameters for both of those reasons. So now that we have it set up, we need to go ahead and do a prepare statement. And in this case, we are going to use a connect and basically specify the used transaction. So whatever gets passed to us, that's what we're going to use. And we are going to do a prepare statement and pass in our SQL statement. Once we do that, then we can go ahead and set our bind parameter in our statement. So this is going to be set int because we have pilot, which is an integer. It's going to be the very first parameter, and this is going to be the pilot no. When it replaces these question marks, it does it from a positional perspective. So if this is the first one, it's going to be parameter 1, and then we would set the value. So if we have lots of different parameters, then it would just increment and we would have them positionally placed. Then we're going to go ahead and execute the prepare statement. So in this case, we have int, and this is going to be rows affected. So anytime that we run a delete statement, or essentially we run an execute update, this is going to give us back the number of rows that are affected by that update. So in this case, it should give us back 1 if we're deleting things correctly. If for some reason we put a statement out there and there's nothing in the database, then we're going to get back 0. But in this case, we should get back 1. And then we can go ahead and say, if I'm not using a transaction, then I want to go ahead and close the database connection. So if I'm not using it, then I want to go ahead and do that. And then I always want to return the rows affected, and that allows me, from an application perspective, if I need to do something, then I can do that. Now you'll notice I'm not doing any try-catch at this level because we have a user interface that's up farther in the chain, and I'm kind of low at this point. So I want my exceptions, if I have one, to bubble up so that I can get it at the user interface level. So that's our delete. Let's go ahead and execute. We should see after we get done that we were able to, rows affected by delete was 1. Then we tried to update something and it was 0. So we haven't gotten that far. So at least we were able to delete the row, and it didn't completely delete it. We'll see that next time we run it, it'll try to delete the same row, because what we did was we passed in to our delete. So let's come down to our testing method, and we went ahead and passed in true for using the transaction. And then as soon as we were done with that transaction, we rolled it back. So in other words, It's like we started after we got done with it and everything was put back the way it was before we began. Okay, so that's going to be one of the things with a transaction. It reverses everything that we did. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to go through and update. And in this case, when we update something, and I'm going to just go ahead and plop in a bunch of code, and then we'll talk about it. You can always pause the video and go through this code at a later point, and I'm just going to replace this here. This is essentially going to allow us to update the pilot record by primary key. And in this case, we have the first name, last name, birth date, social security number, cell phone number, and gender that are going to be passed as parameters. And then we also have our pilot number that's going to be passed, and that's what we're using to qualify for our update. Once we have all of our parameters set, so we're going through, you can see here positionally, it's based off of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's how we're getting the numbers and then associating the actual values based off of the positions. We're going to create our connection, prepare and set our values on our statement. Then we're going to go ahead and execute it. It's going to return to us the rows affected. If we have a transaction, we're not going to close the connection. If we do have a transaction, then at some point we can either commit it or roll back. In our case, when we get down to the bottom and we're trying to test it, we're going to roll it back because we want it to be like we started. And then we're going to return our rows affected so that if our application needs to do something based on number of rows returned, we can. So let's go ahead and test this. And we can see now that we have rows affected by an update is 1. So that is all going to work. So we have our pilot information that we created. We also probably want to code out with our insert our initial thing, because when we do our insert, we're also going to be getting back a sequence that we need to check to see whether we inserted a record. So that's one of the things that we're going to do. So let's go up and let's finish that out. That means that we're going to add a select statement. So let's go ahead and do that up after our get pilot list. So here we're going to replace this. And what we're replacing this with is our select. And in this case, we are going to qualify by our pilot number. So when we pass our SQL statement in, we want to pass the pilot number. The pilot number is essentially going to be passed in, so we're just going to pass it through. It's going to return to us a list of pilots. Now, if we have a primary key, should be returning 1 to us. So we can check to see if the pilots list is empty. If it's not, then we're just going to go ahead and get that very first row out of that list, and then that's going to get us essentially a pilot from the list. Otherwise, if we have an empty, then we're just going to create an instance of a new pilot and return that, and then the user interface can do whatever it needs to do based on what we get back. So that's going to be the retrieval of the pilot, and we'll use that as part of our testing when we do an insert. So for our insert, what are we going to do? So if we come down here for our insert, we have essentially the ID that we want to return instead of the rows impacted, because we want to know what was the ID of that record we just inserted. Sometimes we need to turn around and do something based on that ID. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to paste in some code and we're going to look at it. And this is going to be, we're going to initialize that inserted ID value. Looks like we need to put in a statement up here as well. So let's go up here and let's add in our statement an import for our java.sql.statement. I think that should make it a little bit happier on our insert. So if we come down to the insert now, yes, it's going to have that resolved. Now, why are we needing to resolve that? We'll talk about that in just a second. So our statement, we're going to insert into DBO pilot, first name, last name, birth date, SSN, cell phone number, and gender. We're leaving out the pilot number because it's going to be generated when we insert the record into the table. We have our inserted ID. We're going to initialize it to 0. Now you'll notice that we are doing our connection. We're passing through whether we're using a transaction or not. Then we're going to prepare our statement, passing in our SQL statement. And then we also are passing in the statement.return generated keys. So when I want to return the sequence after I insert a record into the database, I need to provide the statement.return generated keys. And then that will allow me to get the value that was inserted into the table. So we have our pilot get first name. We're providing as first parameter. The last name is a second. The third is the birth date. The fourth, the social security number. The cell phone is fifth and gender is sixth. Then after we set those on our prepare statement, then we're going to go ahead and execute our update just like we did before. We're going to get our rows affected. If we had rows affected that was greater than 0, meaning that we actually inserted something into the database, then we want to go ahead and do our prepared statement.get generated keys. And that's going to return to me a generated key. Once I have the generated key, I can iterate over that with a next and then get the value out of it and set it equal to my inserted ID. That's going to give me my value for my pilot number that was just inserted. And then I can pretty much handle everything else if I was using a transaction that I don't want to close the database. Otherwise, if I wasn't using a transaction, I can close it and I can return my inserted ID. So that pretty much takes care of it. So let's go ahead, and if we look down here, we have a new pilot that we're creating. We're attempting to insert it. Then we're going to go ahead and get our ID back and then try to get that record back. So let's execute this, and we can see that I have a violation of a unique key cannot insert duplicate into pilot. So I have something here that I probably need to change a value because I was using it in test data. Let's make this 3444. Something like that. May work for yours, but not for my scenario. And if I run it again, then it worked. Okay, so I have a good situation. So it's making sure that I have a unique ID on the social security number because it has a unique index on that. So now we have completed all the coding and we should be able to go ahead and run our interface. We have that interface. We saw what it looked like. We have button clicks, etc. So if I look at this on my controller, when I am trying to start at the top here, when I load the data, it's going to refresh the pilot table. The pilot table is going to go down and it's going to execute the pilot list. If we drill into the pilot list, it's going to then execute the refresh pilot list, which is going to return the pilots, so the whole entire thing. So if we would happen to go ahead and execute our application, so if we stand on our pilot application, we can go ahead and execute that. It should launch our GUI. And if I hit that load pilots, I should see my pilots being shown here. Then if I go ahead and if I look at my controller again, I have the ability to delete a pilot. So if we come here and take a look at where we have the delete, so we have edit there, we have the delete, it's going to go ahead and figure out if I selected anything to delete. And if I did, then it's going to go ahead and try to delete that pilot. Okay, so then we can see that we have alert coming back if it was not able to remove it, and then refresh the table. So if I come in here and I have my last pilot that has kind of subpar information, I'm going to go ahead and delete it, and then it requeried and shows me what I can see now, that that row was removed from the table. Then if I decide that I want to go ahead and edit, I can select one of the pilot records, and essentially what it's going to do is it's going to copy all of the information into those text fields where I can edit it. So if I come over here and I pop on one of the records, notice it's not doing anything because I haven't selected anything. I can go ahead and edit that. It's going to bring it up. And then I can put like values. Just don't mess with this because I think this is editable. I can just go ahead and change some of this stuff. Maybe put 2 here and a 6 here or something like that. I can change this to other and I can save. It's going to give me a message and then I should see that I have my updated information. Then I can clear it. I can reselect it. I can update it again, put it back to the way it was, at least some of the information. Not going to go through and do everything, but maybe put it back at least that much. Then if I want to clear and I want to insert, I have the insert option as well that I can go through and save. If I'm saving and I don't have a pilot number, it's empty, then it's going to go ahead and insert. Otherwise, it's going to go through and do the false. And I should show you that where I have validation on this, let's go ahead and put in a record again. And let's see, let's make this. Just pick a date here. And I'm going to skip that, it's not required. And then mail, save. And it's telling me that I have an issue because I have validations that are firing. And so I could probably get rid of some values and go ahead and save it. And then it should show up in the list. Of course, I'm going to get rid of it because it's a bunch of garbage, but you can see that we can interact with our user interface. But where are those validations at? If I go into my pilot class, when I set the values in my pilot class, it's actually doing the validation there. And we can kind of see here that on my setters, that if I'm setting it and it's empty, then I'm going to throw an exception that says first name is required, throwing an exception if it's more than 20 characters. So I'm implementing my validation as part of my setters on that Pojo class, plain old Java object. So this is kind of the walkthrough for the interface for our JavaFX application. If you have any questions on it, please feel free to reach out to me.